Good afternoon, class. All right, that sounded a bit lame, but that's okay. Now, what did you guys learn in reference to deforestation in your previous lessons? Yes, Edwin.
You learned the different effects of deforestation and causes, what we can do to prevent or help stop deforestation.
Okay, so he said that he learned the effects of deforestation, the causes, and what we as humans can do to prevent deforestation. So let's go back to that. What are some of the causes of deforestation? Yes, Daisy.
Causes are building buildings and cutting down the trees.
Okay. So we want to make way for development. Yes, Leticia.
Farmers usually do slash and burn because they need to plant their crops.
Okay. All right, so that is one of the causes. Erwin, one last cause.
Luxury demands to make furniture, beds, etc.
Okay, luxury demands to make furniture, bed, etc. Okay, so then what are the effects of deforestation? We said what some of the causes are. What are the effects? Yes, Kyle. Many animals lose their habitats, their homes. Very good. Erwin?
Imbalance in the atmosphere.
An imbalance in the atmosphere. Imbalance in relation to what, Erwin?
With the oxygen, carbon, and so on.
Okay, creates an imbalance. Okay, good answers. My last question is then, how can we as humans prevent deforestation? What can we do to prevent deforestation? Stephen?
When we cut down a tree, we should plant another one.
When we cut down a tree, we should plant another one. Excellent answer. Anything else? Yes, Kyle?
More protected areas.
Have more protected areas. Does Belize have any protected areas? We do? Yes. Edwin, what's one of our protected areas?
Coxcomb Basin.
The
Coxcomb Basin.
The Coxcomb Basin. Okay, do we have any other? Do we have any other protected areas? Yes, Release.
Guanacaste.
Guanacaste National Park. Okay, good answer, right? But I'm hoping that some of you would look up more Saved by Release, not the bell. I'm hoping that you would look up and see what are more protected areas in our countries. We have several protected areas, okay? Now, today we're going to talk about carbon sources and carbon sinks. Now, I'm thinking that this term is not alien to you. Carbon sources and carbon sinks. Have we heard these terminologies before? Yes. When did we hear these terminologies? In your class, Stephen? I'm hoping you're going to tell me which class.
Science.
Science class. Okay, you're being very general. In reference to what?
I just said the name.
Oh, he just said the name. All right. So he said in class and in science class. So let's continue to narrow it down. In which science class?
Integrated science.
Integrated science. Good. All right. When we talk about carbon sources and carbon sinks, we're referring to what? Edwin?
Carbon cycle.
The carbon cycle. All right, that's a good answer. Let's continue to add to that. Did you hear it in any of our lessons before? Yes, you did. I like those general yeses. So can we continue to elaborate which particular class or what you heard about carbon sources or sinks? I need to give clues? That is ultimately sad. We were talking about the warming climate and we were referring to the carbon cycle. Right? Can anybody, am I tinting at any memories as yet? Yes, Stephen.
I think the heat of what the carbon is producing.
Okay, so the carbon is emitting in the air. All right. Someone else? What is a carbon source? Yadira.
What sources are things that produce carbon?
Things that produce carbon, right? So those are things that emit carbon into the atmosphere. So then what is a carbon sink? Yes, Kyle?
Things that stores carbon.
Things that store carbon. All right. So what are some examples of carbon sinks? Yes, Yadira?
Trees.
Trees store carbon. Okay. Glendy, you had another idea? No? Someone? Yes, Erwin?
Fossil fuels.
Fossil fuels. Okay. Someone else? Yes, Yadira?
The atmosphere.
The atmosphere. Okay. What about our pine forests and our oceans? Those are some of the biggest sources of carbons that we have. So then if the biggest sources of carbon sinks. So then what sources carbon? What emits carbon? What gives carbon, emits it into the atmosphere? Lets it out into the atmosphere. Stephen? Humans. Yes, we do. Anything else? Yes, Erwin?
Animals.
Animals. We also have plants who also are sources, carbon sources. Now today we're going to look at 3 short videos consecutively. The second one, will be a little bit lengthy. But what I'd like you to do is to watch these videos and jot down the major points, right, of the videos. All of them refers to carbon sinks and source. The first video will talk about the carbon cycle. So you're going to look at that video and you're going to record the major points. The second one refers to the mountain pine beetle. How many of us recall the mountain pine beetle? We do? All right. And the last one refers to deforestation. And all these 3 topics, the carbon cycle, the mountain pine beetle, and deforestation, all of them combined will give us a better idea of carbon sources and carbon sinks and the levels of carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere. Are we ready? Good.
Carbon. It can be found anywhere on Earth and makes up an important part of all living matter, such as plants, animals, and humans. This is its king.
As well as in living things, carbon is found in the atmosphere in the gas carbon dioxide and is dissolved in water such as oceans and rivers. It's also found in rocks, shells, and in fossil fuels. All the movements between the different places where carbon is found make up the carbon cycle. Don't worry, I'll explain it to you. Let's start with the land. Plants and trees use carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. They store carbon as they grow, releasing both carbon dioxide and oxygen. Animals and humans also give out carbon dioxide when they breathe. Carbon can also be released if plants are burned, and when they decompose and become part of the soil. When dead plant and animal matter accumulates faster than it is decomposed, some of it can be compacted and transformed into fossil fuels, such as gas, oil, and coal. It took millions of years to make these fuels naturally, but we are burning them much quicker than it took for them to form. Dead plants can also float down rivers, which is one way carbon is transported from the land to the ocean. So far, carbon is present in photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition, compaction, transformation, and transportation. Phew. Okay, now the water cycle. Carbon moves both ways between the ocean surface and the atmosphere. Ocean plants use the dissolved carbon dioxide in the water for photosynthesis, and they store this carbon just like the land plants. Then, ocean animals eat these plants, and so the carbon gets transferred again. Ocean plants and animals release carbon dioxide back into the water through respiration. Some ocean animals use the carbon in the ocean to make their shells. When they die, their carbon-filled shells dissolve or settle on the ocean floor. When ocean plants and animals die, they decompose in the water. The decomposing plants and animals either sink and dissolve or settle on the ocean floor where they get buried in the sediment. Over a long period of time, rocks may form and wear down, which also contributes to the carbon cycle. Finally, water moving between the different layers of the ocean also carries carbon. So why is the carbon cycle relevant to humans? Well, we know that levels of carbon in the atmosphere have increased a lot in the last century. This is largely due to human activity, especially the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation. When we cut down and burn trees, they can't soak up any more carbon, and they release the carbon they've stored during their lives. And when we burn fossil fuels, more carbon is released into the atmosphere. For example, to run cars, produce electricity, manufacture goods, and heat homes. There is a limit to how much oceans and land can soak up. So on the whole, carbon levels in the atmosphere are increasing. Since carbon is a major greenhouse gas, this contributes to climate change. Not just the rise in temperatures we are now seeing, but also the rise scientists predict will occur over the coming decades. We all use energy in our lives, which mostly comes from the burning of fossil fuels. By reducing our own carbon dioxide emissions, we can do our bit to help tackle climate change.
Kindly jot down 3 points as it relates to the carbon cycle from the video. Ainsworth, 3 things that you can recall from the video. Okay. Good. Can't remember anything? The video that we're going to watch now talks about the mountain pine beetle and its effects on deforestation, carbon sources and sinks, and climate change. So kindly jot down again the major points from this video.
Pine forests in the western United States are in the midst of a major catastrophe. An uncontrollable epidemic of pine beetle infestations has swept down from British Columbia, leaving a trail of dead trees in its wake. Entire hillsides of once healthy forest have been wiped out, as piles of dead wood accumulate on the roadsides. While pine beetle infestations have occurred in the past, the severity of this current outbreak is unprecedented and may come as a result of our gradually warming climate.
We know that the winters have been getting warmer in western North America over the last 2 decades. We've measured this. And the snowpacks have been getting lower. And this combination of warmer winters and lower snowpacks has sort of a 1-2 punch effect on the forest. On the one hand, it allows the beetle populations to remain larger through the winter, so that in the spring there's a larger number of beetles to spread through the trees. In the second way, it stresses the trees. These trees depend so much on the snowpack to get them through the dry part of the summer. And so when they become water stressed, they become more susceptible to the beetle infection.
The carnage from the outbreak creates numerous dangers for the global community. In addition to the immediate side effects, such as the loss of habitat for a number of species, and the creation of a massive fire hazard. Scientists are concerned that the death of these large tracts of trees could have a disastrous impact on the global carbon budget.
Forests affect the carbon budget of the atmosphere through two dominant processes: photosynthesis, where they bring carbon dioxide in from the atmosphere, and respiration, where they release carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And it's the balance of these processes that determine whether a particular forest is a carbon source or a carbon sink.
Healthy forests are generally carbon sinks, meaning they remove excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. In these forests, trees remove carbon dioxide from the air through photosynthesis. This process creates sugars, which are sent down to the roots of the tree and used as energy. A number of bacteria and fungi surround the roots of the tree and live in the soil between the trees, feeding off excess sugars and dead material that falls to the forest floor. All of these bacteria and fungi, as well as the roots themselves, release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere in a process called respiration. As long as the overall amount of carbon dioxide absorbed through photosynthesis remains greater than the carbon dioxide released from respiration, the forest is considered a carbon sink.
So when beetles come into a forest and they kill the trees that are in that forest, one way to think about that is, again, that cuts off the carbon income of that forest. The trees stop growing and they die. So you're no longer, for a while there, getting carbon coming out of the atmosphere and into the system, but the microbes are still there, and they're still eating what's around, and they're going to keep sending it out. They're going to keep spending it and putting it out to the atmosphere.
So you have the balance, the carbon dioxide balance between the forest and the atmosphere changing in both directions, decreasing carbon dioxide uptake, increasing carbon dioxide loss. And our initial hypothesis was that the overall net effect of this would be very large carbon losses to the atmosphere.
These large carbon losses could accelerate the rate of climate change, dumping more carbon dioxide into an already overloaded atmosphere. A group of scientists from the University of Colorado have been monitoring the carbon dioxide emission rates in a beetle-infested forest near Fraser, Colorado.
We're here in the Fraser Experimental Forest, which is maintained by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and supports research. Our experiment is looking at the effects of beetle kill on this forest on the CO2 that's emitted from the soil to the atmosphere.
The researchers are taking measurements from a number of plots that were killed during subsequent years of the infestation. This will allow them to create a model that can be used to predict the rates of carbon dioxide loss in a forest in the years following a large trauma.
When you have a major disturbance that comes into the forest, like an insect outbreak that removes a lot of your trees and a lot of your carbon uptake, no one really understands those dynamics and pressures to global change as well as we would like yet. So we're looking into how does the CO2 coming back to the atmosphere change when you've taken the trees out of the equation and they end up dying over time.
The Fraser Forest provided the researchers with a good starting point for their investigations, but in order to complete an accurate analysis, they needed to know the exact dates the trees were killed. Halfway across the state, at the University of Colorado's Mountain Research Station, a fortuitous situation provided the researchers with the means to complete their analysis.
We've had researchers here for the last decade basically killing trees for different experiments. And so we had this natural, sort of a fortuitous experiment that we could use where trees had been killed at different times, different stages over the last decade.
These trees were killed using a method called girdling, which isolates the needles from the roots of the tree and is very similar to the effects of a beetle attack. Using records showing the exact date the girdled trees were killed, the researchers were able to construct a precise analysis showing how carbon dioxide emission rates will change in the years following an infestation. The shape of this analysis, however, came as a surprise to the researchers and showed significantly lower levels of carbon dioxide emission than they first predicted.
One of our major discoveries was that in the first few years after beetles have come in and killed trees, the carbon released from the surrounding soil actually goes down.
What we're finding is that the sugars that the tree was transporting down into the ground, when you cut that off, you reduce the ability of the soil microbes, the roots, and everything in the soil to respire. And so you're reducing the amount of respiration that comes out. Now, after 5 to 6 years, there's a buildup of plant material, dead material, leaf litter, and that seems to drive the respiration upwards again. But it never gets to the point, it never recovers to the point it was before the beetle killed it, at least over the span of a decade.
This second dip in the carbon dioxide rates surprised the researchers, who predicted that these rates would continue to rise as more dead materials became available for the soil microbes.
So there's less carbon dioxide being released from the soil than we originally expected. And it's quite a bit less than we thought. And so even though the carbon balance may shift to a carbon source, so the CO2 might come out of the ecosystem now, it's not as dramatic an effect as we thought it would be.
In order to understand the drop-off in carbon dioxide levels, laboratory analyses are currently being performed on the soil from the plots and on the respired carbon dioxide itself. Their aim is to understand how changes in the behavior of the soil microbes might account for the lower respiration levels.
If we do these analyses and we see, for example, that the microbes are changing what they eat, which essentially they're going to have to do. I mean, if you're cutting off that carbon income, what essentially you're doing is cutting off a food supply that they rely on. You cut that off, they got to go eat something else. We need to understand how fast do they do that, how well do they do that, how big is that change, and by doing so, we ought to be able to understand not only what the system we're studying may do, but some more general principles about what happens in any ecosystem where you change the conditions, you change that food supply for the bacteria. What are they going to do? So, there may be answers there that we can stick into general models that help us predict the future, help us predict, if humans do X, Y, or Z to a given place, what's going to happen to the carbon in that system? And that's part of our goal here, is to go after those kind of answers.
The signs of climate change are beginning to manifest themselves in the world around us. From the rising forecast to the scores of dead trees on the Colorado hillsides, we are beginning to experience the effects of a growing human footprint on the planet. But with each new discovery comes a better understanding of the impact our actions have. And through that understanding, we can hope to preserve these ecosystems for future generations as well.
Jot down 3 major points from that video. These points are very important to our next activity. One minute. Okay, and we're going to watch the final video, which is the shortest one. So let's look at the key points.
Julia Pongrantz of the Carnegie Institution's Department of Global Ecology is lead author of a new study on the impact of historical events on global climate. It's a common misconception that human impact on climate began with the large-scale burning of coal and oil in the industrial era. Humans started to influence the environment thousands of years ago by changing the vegetation cover of the earth when we cleared forests for agriculture. During high mortality events such as wars and plagues, large areas of croplands and pastures have been abandoned and forests have regrown, absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. On the other hand, clearing forests releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere when the trees and other vegetation are burned or when they decay. The rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide resulting from deforestation is recognizable in ice cores from Greenland and the Antarctic that predate the fossil fuel era. The research used a global climate carbon cycle model to track how land use affected climate during 4 major events from 800 AD to the present. They are the Mongol invasions in Asia from 1200 to 1380, the Black Death in Europe from 1347 to 1400, the conquest of the Americas from 1519 to 1700, and the fall of the Ming Dynasty in China from 1600 to 1650. During the short events such as the Black Death and the Ming Dynasty collapse, the forest regrowth wasn't enough to overcome the emissions from decaying material in the soil. During the longer-lasting ones like the Mongol invasion and the conquest of the Americas, there was enough time for the forest to regrow and absorb significant amounts of carbon. The Mongol invasions had the biggest impact of the 4 events studied. Regrowth on depopulated lands stockpiled nearly 700 million tons of carbon absorbed from the atmosphere. This is equivalent to the world's total annual demand for gasoline today. Dwarfing each of these events, however, has been the historical trend towards increasing deforestation. Over centuries, this has released vast amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as crop and pasture lands expanded to feed growing human populations. The global impact of forest regrowth and even the long-lasting events was diminished by the continued clearing of forest elsewhere in the world. The study is relevant to today's climate issues by showing how land use choices can alter the global carbon cycle. Today, about a quarter of the net primary production on the Earth's land surface is used by humans in some way, mostly through agriculture. In the past, our impact on climate and the carbon cycle has been unintentional, but we are now in a position to make land use decisions that will diminish our impact on climate and the carbon cycle. The study is published in the January 20th, 2011 online issue of the Holocene. This is John Strom for the Carnegie Institution.
Okay. 3 major points on deforestation and its effect on carbon emission. We've only seen a couple people mention the words carbon sources and sinks. Don't try and hurry write it now. Seconds. Okay. What can you tell me about the carbon cycle from watching the videos? What did you learn in reference to the carbon cycle? Yes, Edwin.
Carbon is found is emitted during transformation, decomposition, and respiration.
Okay, so those are the 3 processes where we emit carbon. What about deforestation? What role does deforestation play in emitting of carbon? Yes, Erwin.
When they have deforestation, that means they have less carbon sources, carbon sinks. So there will be more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because there will be less trees to take them in.
Okay, very good. What about the mountain pine beetle? How does that affect the whole climate change issue? One of my girls. Yadira?
High temperatures causes the beetles to infect the trees.
Okay, so the high temperatures causes the life cycle of the beetle. Remember we talked about its life cycle. So it causes the beetles to, remember that they go through various stages, and usually when winter comes, they are in their larvae stage, right? And usually at winter, or if the temperatures are cold, it would kill out some of the larvae, which means that some of the beetles would not survive to infect the trees. However, with the warming temperatures, it provides a perfect climate for them to continue to thrive and live and go into their pupa stage and then eventually become adults. And that would lead to more infestation of the pine forest. Now, what is the difference between carbon sources and sinks? Yes, Stephen.
Carbon sinks is when carbon is released to the atmosphere.
Carbon sinks is when carbon is released to the atmosphere. Does everyone agree with that? By a show of hands. Who agrees that carbon sinks is when carbon is released into the atmosphere? Who would like to rebut that? Daisy.
Carbon source when gas is released into the air, and carbon sinks are what store carbon source.
Okay, does everybody agree with Daisy's response? Let me see a raise of hands. She says that carbon source releases carbon into the atmosphere and the sink stores carbons, right? What happens when there are too many carbon sources and too little sinks? What happens when we have too much carbon released into the atmosphere and we don't have enough sinks to store the carbon? Yes, Kyle.
That will cause global warming because the carbon dioxide will have nowhere it will stay up in the atmosphere, causing the earth to get hotter.
Okay, does everybody agree with that? That's a perfectly correct answer. Whenever we have too many sources, meaning that we have all of these different elements releasing carbon into the atmosphere and we don't have enough sinks to store them, and our sinks being the ocean, being the pine forest, we don't have all of those things to store the carbon, it means that too much will be in the atmosphere, thus leading to what we call global warming. Now, in your groups, you're labeled into 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s. We're going to do an activity called Jigsaw. And this is where all the persons who have number 1, you're going to respond to the question, what is the carbon cycle? All the persons who are number 2s are going to respond to the question, what are carbon sources and sinks, and how do sinks and sources affect climate change? All persons who are number 3s, you're going to respond to the question, what role does deforestation play in the carbon cycle? And I want some examples. And number 4 is, how does human activity contribute to carbon in the atmosphere? So I need you to get into your little mini circles right now. And you are going to respond to these questions. And Mr. Torres will time you for 5 minutes. After your 5 minutes is up, you're going to regroup. And in each of those groups, I'm going to have a number 1, 2, 3, and 4 sharing your responses. Do we understand? So it's very important that within your home group, which is numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, that you learn the answer to your question quite effectively, because you are going to be representing that question and response by yourselves when we regroup. Is that clear? 5 minutes to respond to your question. And I want to hear discussion going on. You guys remember when we did the carbon cycle? To your group members. Okay. Now that you have had your discussion, we are now going to share our responses, and this is going to be timed. So I'm going to say question 1, and I'm going to read the question, After reading the question, number 1 will have the opportunity to present the answer for 1 minute. Mr. Torres will time us. He will say time after 1 minute has passed, and that is the end of your discussion. We'll move on to question 2, where I read the question, and that person will then have 1 minute to share the response with that group. And that is the way it's going to continue with questions 3 and 4. Are there any questions? Any questions in response to the instructions? Okay. So, we are now going to regroup. I need 3 persons to stand up from each group. 3 persons to stand up from each group. Okay. Now I need these persons to rotate and go to another group so that I will have a numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 in each group. Hold out your numbers. Let me see your numbers. I need a number 2 here. Glendy, wonderful. Okay, I don't know. You're number 2. Rosalina, what number are you? Okay. Who's 1, 2, 3, 4? Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Wonderful. All right, could you guys stand up, please? We're not going to sit during this part of the activity. Form your circle. A short repeat of our instructions. I am going to read the question. After reading the question, I will say begin. At that point, Mr. Torres will time us for 1 minute. When he says time, you stop speaking. We move on to number 2, and the same instructions will apply, and so forth for 3 and 4. Are we ready? So by the end of this lesson, or this activity, we would have all been exposed to responses of these 4 questions. Numbers 1. What is the carbon cycle? Begin. Silence. Numbers 2. What are carbon sources and sinks, and how do sinks and sources relate to climate change? Share examples. Begin. What are sinks? Stop. Number 3. What role does deforestation play in the carbon cycle? Give examples. What role does deforestation play in the carbon cycle? Give examples. Begin.
When deforestation releases carbon dioxide.
What is deforestation? My work is done already. Go ahead, please. Let me hear again.
20 seconds. Time.
Numbers 4. How does human activity contribute to carbon in the atmosphere? How does human activity contribute to carbon in the atmosphere? Share examples. Begin. Thank you very much. Sit down. So then, by now everyone should have been exposed to responses of all 4 questions. You just basically taught yourselves the answers without me having to tell you what they were. So now, number 1, a volunteer. What is the carbon cycle? One of my home groups, number 1. So what is the carbon cycle? Basically explain what it is.
Carbon cycle is a process in which carbon is released and then dispersed into the atmosphere. It takes a process which begins with the plants, which absorb or use the carbon in the atmosphere during photosynthesis. When these plants die, they start decaying, which releases the carbon dioxide, which they have been storing for years. When these plants decay and the remnants of the plants and dead animals, which also release carbon dioxide during decay, they turn into fossil fuels, which then after humans discover and they use, and when they burn these fossil fuels, it releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, which then starts again when the plants during photosynthesis absorb that same carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
Very good. Give him a round of applause. Let's give Edwin a round of applause. That's the spirit. What are carbon sinks and sources? A home group, number 2. Yes, Erwin.
Carbon sinks are they store carbon. Carbon sources are sources that give out carbon into the atmosphere. The way that it affects global warming is that if there are too much carbon sources and not enough carbon sinks, the earth will become hotter. Examples of carbon sources are us humans, cars, etc. And carbon sinks are the forests, the oceans, etc.
Okay, give him a round of applause, a healthy one. Okay, number 3, what role does deforestation play in the carbon cycle? A home group for number 3. What role does deforestation play in the carbon cycle?
Deforestation is when you burn down trees, and when you burn down trees, this contributes to the atmosphere. You have an imbalance in carbon source and carbon sinks because we are releasing too much carbon dioxide into the air, but you don't have enough carbon sinks. That means storage to store the carbon source. And some examples are human that release carbon dioxide and deforestation, that you don't have enough carbon sinks.
Okay, give her a round of applause. Less healthy, but not too bad. Number 4, how does human activity contribute to carbon in the atmosphere? Can that person kindly come to the front here? Okay. Christia, go ahead.
Human activity contribute to carbon in the atmosphere because they slash and burn the trees and they don't plant a replacement. Also by burning fossil fuels that release carbon. Examples are factories, cars, humans, animals, and industries.
Okay, wonderful. Give her a round of applause. Okay. Now, when we're completed with the lesson, you're going to do an activity which is called Tell a Friend. And that Tell a Friend means that each one of you that came up and do the presentation of your response, we're going to go outside and we're going to tell one of our friends. You're going to share your responses with either Mrs. Roches, Ms. Shaban, Ms. Leslie, or Ms. Martinez. Your question and the response to your question, right? Now our final activity, give yourselves a round of applause for doing such a good job. Can you quickly put your chairs back in the semicircles? Okay, class. Now, this final section of our lesson, we're going to see an experiment. And I need you to observe and tell me what you think is happening. Right? So I'm going to perform the experiment, and it does relate to carbon dioxide. And you're going to observe what happens. You're going to state your observations, and you're going to tell me the purpose of the experiment. Are we clear? All right. Now this is a solution called BTV. And this solution is what we call an indicator. I might need your assistance, Mr. Torres. Here in this test tube labeled V, we have vinegar. Right. Now here we made a little cone shape out of aluminum foil, and in that cone we're going to place some baking soda. Right? Here is the device that we will use to connect both tubes. You just slide this a little. Turn this on the side a little. Yeah, get the cutting. On that side. It's mysterious. Huh? I'm not creating a bomb, don't worry. Look at what happens. I'm going to put a little bit more of our baking soda in there. Walk it around and show them for me. Funny. Who can tell me what just happened? Steven, you need a microphone. Steven? What just occurred?
When soda is added with aluminum and is put in the vinegar, it reacts and what the name is?
BTV.
The BTV, the color changes to green.
Okay, the color changes to green. Someone else? Edwin, what are your observations?
I observed that when the baking soda was dipped into placed into the vinegar, since the top of the little instrument was sealed, the straw that was connecting two of the containers, the two test tubes, the gas that was released when you put the baking soda into the vinegar it traveled into the tube and into the straw and went down into the next solution, the BTB, and probably had a chemical reaction which caused it to change it in its color.
And what color did it change to?
Green.
From a what to a what?
A blue to a green.
From a blue to a green? Okay, good. Plus what you just observed was we made what we call the carbonic acid by mixing soda, household baking soda and vinegar together, right? Now the BTB solution is an indicator, and the gas that was released from the carbonic acid is what we call carbon dioxide. Now the change in color indicated how much carbon dioxide was released from the carbonic acid. How many of you have opened a soda pop before? Soda bottle. When you see the bubbles and the fizz, right? That is carbon being released from that, the carbon dioxide. So it turning yellowish and then into a yellowish greenish color is an indicator of how much carbon dioxide was released. Okay? So that is a simple way to test how much carbon dioxide is released from a particular source. Are we clear? Okay. I'd like to thank you very much for your maximum participation in our lesson. Give ourselves a round of applause.